Red Hat OpenShift is the sponsor for our container platform coverage from Oscon in Austin, Texas. OpenShift reaches across open source communities to collaborate for healthy upstream development. The goal? Ensure the support for features and functionalities that end users require across the overall ecosystem. You can learn more at openshift.com. Hey, it's Alex Williams of the New Stack here at Oscon. It's the Tuesday of the conference and dedicated to containers. And we thought we would have a discussion here over the span of the day about container platforms. And Red Hat was kind enough to sponsor us. And our discussion right now is about OCI. And that stands for the Open Container Initiative. And with us is Vincent Batts, who is on the technical oversight board for OCI. Also joining us is Ben Ball, our technical editor at the New Stack, and who is here for the conference. Great to see you guys.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, I was just reading about OCI last night, just refreshing myself, and I had forgotten that it's actually unique in some ways. It has this technical oversight board that makes it unique, doesn't it? Is there some distinction there, or is it maybe not so much?
Yeah, so the governance around OCI has partially been challenging because of some of the ways that it's been set up to be as fair and equitable as possible. So when it was first launched, loads of companies were very interested. When Docker announced it last summer, lots and lots of companies got on board, and they were considered like the founding members. But rather than letting the founding members dictate everything, they set up maintainers to be technically involved, but they also assembled a technical oversight board, which had a whole nomination process. It had a voting process that went through a very fair voting process that went through a third party, and from that, elected members who were maybe not even affiliated with the founding process or otherwise to be a part of the technical oversight board, and really just to handle dispute resolution and other pieces that the maintainers are not necessarily interested in, or the founding members wouldn't have the authority to dictate.
So that's your role then, is to oversee those, those issues as they arise.
Yeah, so hopefully that role will be minimal, if at all. So far I'm a maintainer on the runtime and the image spec, so I'm technically involved, but was also nominated and elected to be a part of the technical oversight board. But yeah, it's typically only an as-needed involvement, and so far that's only been for one piece, and that was when the topic of the image spec, a distributable container image, came up, whether or not it should be its own project, and that was the whole process and voted on, and now we haven't had another need for meeting recently. So
what became of that?
So you can go check out github.com/opencontainers/image spec, and it is the runtime spec that most people have heard of if they think of open containers, like Run C, which is the underbelly of Docker's daemon. Run C is what can call out to a root file system and invoke a container, and that's interesting, but it's not very distributable. There's a lot of pieces about that aren't portable across hosts, and so when people think of pushing and pulling images and saving it out and shipping an image from one host to another host, that is a distributable image. And so the Open Containers image spec is now standardizing and specifying what it is that you can distribute, and it won't be limited to one particular tool's life cycle. Initially, it will be very, very compatible with the Docker v2 registry and the Docker 110 image format. So there's no breaking changes planned for that image spec at all right now.
So Ben, what's your What's your questions you have about OCI right now, where it is?
Well, basically, kind of a general question, Vincent. Is there any kind of new direction or anything new with OCI lately, or maybe a future development that's kind of planned? I'm just kind of curious if there's an overall goal or mission right now.
Yeah, sure. So there's a couple of tangential things running together. There is planned for both the runtime spec and the image spec this summer to have a version 1.0. So everything that you hear about and all encouragement for integration with open containers is currently pre-release software, pre-1.0. And so there, for both the runtime spec and the image spec, there's a V1 targeted for this summer. And what that will mean is that will be the standard which tooling and integration and things like Docker and any other registry runtime implementations or people that are producing images that have tooling to do this can build to that spec. So that's targeted this summer, and that's a huge deal. What relates to that also is that there's a working group under the Open Containers initiative or foundation around compliance and certification, so that people and integrations and companies can say, yes, my tooling is compliant. Like you heard, the latest Docker release was OCI compliant. In this compliance work group will actually go through what does that mean to be compliant with the image spec, and what does it mean to be compliant with the runtime spec. So it's not just a marketing jargon, but it's actually a technical compliance, and that you've built a certified runtime that is compliant. You've built a certified image that is compliant. So these are all very important things that are going to help overall reduce risk for people that are building tooling and doing integrations in the container space.
What makes it compliant? What is it that you've needed to do to make it compliant?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's part of what that working group is chartered with, and it's actually been one component of open containers I've not been deeply involved in, just so as not to spread myself too thin. So very smart people involved there, and a lot of people are very interested in teasing that out, because you certainly wouldn't want that word to just become a watered-down marketing term, but actually that you could produce an image per se, push it to a registry, and then Docker could pull it down, or otherwise maybe Docker save load to some format that you know is going to stay supportable by tools for some period of time, whether that's a timeline, like some period of years, who knows what.
But what this really speaks to is the need to have that kind of compliance, so you can have kind of these distributed platforms, essentially.
Yep.
I mean,
interoperability and
if you can't have that, you basically, then it makes, you can run into all kinds of fixes that you need to make along the way.
Yeah, and you'll find yourself in the situation that classic problems. API versioning is very hard, and if there are, while it's also just as hard to lock down and say no, you can't break this format. API versioning is hard, and so many tools in the container space are finding themselves where they might have built and released with maybe a version like Docker 1.8, and that's what they built a spec with now. And the version's moved on, but they might find themselves locked in and doing this kind of lockstep upgrades, or even having environments with multiple versions of different tools going on that are breaking various workflows. That's a difficult problem to solve for anybody.
Right.
Right.
So Ben, I'm curious from your perspective. What does that speak to for you? And you've been really the person who's been editing the ebooks that we've been producing on the Docker and container ecosystem. What are some of the things that you've come across in the book that speaks to kind of the direction of OCI and questions you might have about it?
Well, a lot of what we've been doing, especially in, say, book 2 of the series, was actually looking at contributors to OCI, kind of trying to understand the makeup of these open source initiatives, and really kind of understand who is behind the contributions. We talked earlier, Vincent, I was saying that you showed up a lot in there. Red Hat in general shows up quite a bit in there. and it's very interesting to us because we sort of think that there's a connection between the kinds of companies, the peoples, the teams, the roles that are contributing to these initiatives, and ultimately how useful they are and how widespread they're going to be. And it's not a connection I think we've fully formed yet,
Sure.
because it's hard to say what factors contribute the most to whether a program is going to be successful. And I don't know that that's even our goal, is to say if something is going to be successful, but to just maybe kind of denote what it is that makes up these initiatives and maybe correlate them in the future.
Yeah.
I'm very interested in where OCI is going. We're talking about V1. I'm especially really curious what's going to happen post V1. Is this something where you are expecting an increased adoption after a stable first
Absolutely.
1.0?
Honestly, it's been the most interesting part of this bootstrapping process, and this is standards are really only what you have as a basis of comparison. And while containers tools have been around for a long time, Docker is far and away what has caught the pervasive ear of container integrations. And so for that reason, that's why the V1 is very, very much based on Docker formats, the run C layout, and now with the image spec being pulled from Docker V2 registry interactions and the Docker 110 formats that are saved to disk or exported. But as open containers being pre-release, many of the projects and companies and otherwise that already have existing infrastructure and tooling, they're like, the common response is, we'll wait for a V1 before we start spending any of our time and resources on it. And most of the companies that, like you mentioned, people being involved, most of the companies and participants that are involved in open containers are those that already have immense amount of vested interest in it. CoreOS, Google with the Google Registry and container scheduler, Kubernetes, Red Hat, OpenShift, otherwise Huawei is involved, and it goes on and on. Even folks that aren't maintainers are active on the list, IBM and otherwise, Pivotal. And while some of these people are going head to head, they all have very much invested interest, and they are the ones that are putting the first foot forward, even in pre-release software, to iron out as much as we can, make it as low barrier to entry for V1. And there's no breaking changes that I'm imagining for V2 and on, but just that once we have a V1, then it's something that anybody can implement to and not have to worry about pre-release software that's going to be subject to change and break over and over and over.
So what are some of the use cases, that we, that you expect to see with the version 1.0?
Use cases are going to be various tooling that may or may not need to pull in a lot of infrastructure, a lot of different daemons. There's loads of build target machines, CI infrastructure that produce, root file systems or different runtimes or whatnot, build routes, almost as simple as a make target. If your project had something like a make or a CMake target that you just said, and produce an OCI image, you don't need to have tooling involved. I mean, other additional daemons and all this other stuff involved. You just need to know what format to export. You might already have every other component of that going on, and if you're worried about having additional daemons. If you're worried about having additional daemons and the version and compatibility of those daemons, it adds complexity to open source projects who often might not be businesses. They might just be trying to get their open source project out there with no budget at all and as low overhead as possible. So the use cases are really just a format that it can be trickled down into any tooling that interacts with software, really.
So when is the 1.0 release expected?
The roadmap documents say June, which is next month, and it was really targeted by a lot of folks, and otherwise because DockerCon is mid to late June, the 19th and 20th in June in Seattle, and really everybody's anxiously anticipating a 1.0, at least in the year since it was Open Containers Initiative was announced. There's still a lot of ground to get covered and a lot of things to get ironed out, but I still feel it's a pretty aggressive and confident expectation to have a 1.0 in and around that time frame.
What ground needs to be covered?
There is plenty of since some of the formats and documentation has been carried over from Docker, there's a lot of implicit expectations in the documentation. Case in point, like the Docker v2 format, which allows content addressability and it allows signing and it allows distribution of Docker images. Part of the debate that happened during the technical oversight board of producing an image spec was the Docker voices involved were very against having the spec include any amount of a registry API or a notion of how the naming happens, because this is pieces that are controlled by the Docker registry, by the hub and other components, and even signing is Docker uses with the Notary and the update framework implementation of Notary that they've got. And so they wanted it to just be the image spec. So when you pull out some of the documentation that is completely expecting there to be an API and a way of signing and a way of having a reference to these content addressable objects, it leaves the documentation with a lot of holes in it. And so while trying to work with the technical ask of not defining an API or whatever, or at least making layers like signing optional and not defined in the spec, filling in those holes, that's mostly the ground to be covered in the image spec.
So will there be an API?
You will likely see various people having their own way of distributing, whether it's just here's a URL to a compressed tarball and you can right-click, save as, and import it or whatever. It like I said, it is compatible with the Docker v2 formats that are used in the registry. So pushing and pulling it to the registry is the registry API is something that's expected to just work. So as far as compliance there, that might be a first low barrier to entry for a lot of folks. The fear from everybody that wished the API would be defined out in the Open Containers Initiative was if you leave it as optional or completely undefined, that there could be fragmentation in the ecosystem of people just willy-nilly making their own new API, which can go two ways completely. It could either, locking down an API could harbor innovation, but it could also allow fragmentation for people distributing it in different ways that might not be compatible with each other. So, will there be an API? It's at this point it's being left up to the community to find next best practices and not be pushing for how people must distribute it immediately.
So what was the arguments that you heard about not having an API?
What was the arguments that I heard in favor of not having an API? Leaving the door open for additional and future implementations. Because I've been involved in Docker for the Docker group in development for quite some time, and part of that for the last couple of years has been with the distribution format. And there was a lot learned when going from the first way of the Docker, or the V1 of Docker Registry, to the very first steps towards content addressability, and then there was later a different schema for content addressability, and there's been lots of lessons learned, and so lots of the arguments against it were just there might be future lessons learned, which could always be said that would be a future version of API specification, but really just wanting to leave that door completely open for who knows what, BitTorrent, synchronization of file systems, or something, IPFS or something else like that. There could be any number of ways to do it, and that's fair and true, but that's not what the industry is doing right now. The industry is using REST-based, content addressable type, Docker registry, or otherwise, the Git Smart HTTP. There's other ways of doing HTTP REST type content addressability, and so the arguments against it were just let's leave the door completely open and not even define the door, even as we're using it today.
So why would I guess I'm questioning because why would Red Hat be for or against that, for example?
For or against that, the Red Hat's been involved for a long time, and most notably in format and continuing to try and draw groups together. And the classic example is if we have too many groups going head to head on this, it can cause fragmentation. And the classic example is the RPM versus Debian package wars. In the late,
which wars?
The RPM versus Debian packages. In the late 90s, when Red Hat was taken off and Debian was already 8 years in the making, and it was these two trains of thought going head to head on how Linux packaging is supposed to work, and it became a huge rift in the Linux community, and there was lots of fallout in both directions. It hardened a lot of people into the Red Hat way of thinking, and hardened a lot of people into the Debian way of thinking, and loads of other people fragmented into any other number of Linuxes. But what it did as a whole for the ecosystem is it really set back commercialization of Linux by 5 or 10 years easy. You only had a handful of groups with engineering resources or otherwise that could power through it and make their own Linux derivatives and solve the problems in their own ways, or use Debian and RPM packages as expected and solve their problems. But as a whole, a lot of companies that just wanted to be able to move into that Linux space said, maybe this is a little too volatile for us right now. They haven't gotten it figured out. And so here we are 10, 15 years later, and Linux is pervasive, and people have just gotten over, whether it's an RPM package or a Debian package, or we just shove everything into a big tarball completely. And we don't want to see that happen again. And there's a lot of momentum in this space, and that kind of fragmentation would be bad for everybody. And this is not a Red Hat statement, this is an ecosystem statement. Nobody wants that kind of fragmentation.
So what's your guys' position on this? What's the
on
Red Hat position on this issue around the API?
The API is honestly.
Do you think there should be an API? Do you think there should not be an API?
I personally, even if it was just an optional layer, an optional definition, like here is a way of doing it, and it's not a requirement that you implement it. To be image spec compatible, you have to implement this API. No. But if you're going to do such, here is a known way that has worked for us up to this point. And it could allow for optionally not using that and making your own. That would be fine, but leaving it up to people just doing whatever they want, it's perhaps one of those times where you just might let loose of the controls a little bit and hope the right thing happens, because after all, it's open source, and the community is going to do whatever they feel best.
There's some chaos in that.
There's a little anticipation of chaos in that. And,
yeah.
But so be it.
And alliances, and and all kinds of other outcomes that are possible when everyone has
sure. And it's not
when everyone has a way to do it.
Yeah, and ultimately it's not a control statement at all. It's an encouragement statement of here's a homogeneous way of ways that we know things can work together, an encouragement for people who are implementing that they can use known paths and reduce their headache in figuring out what works for them.
This is the path this is a path that you see emerge with open source communities. So this is part and parcel of how these things evolve, isn't it?
Yep, usually.
Yeah,
as far as I've seen.
So Ben, any last question?
Yeah, I was going to kind of ask, actually building off of this discussion we've been having a little bit, is there any other conflicts you kind of see coming up immediately that might have a similar, not falling out, but kind of different oppositions? Is there anything that's kind of hotly debated right now besides this?
Yeah, no, not particularly. And I mean, I don't feel that this is really even hotly debated. It's just something that, it's just I think a step along in the direction of allowing people not having lock-in and allowing for lower risk tooling integrations and common interfaces. But as far as other conferences coming up, no, not particularly. There's so many conferences always, but it's just always baby steps. That's really all I can say.
So it's a pretty common cycle of resolution and figuring things out.
I won't say it's completely common.
I don't think it is. I think there's a lot of market forces here, which you don't really have to speak to, but that seems to be kind of the crux of this.
Yeah, and just the momentum and speed at which this whole ecosystem has come into existence has been pretty much the biggest reason why people have felt compelled to make common standards, because if we can't find common places that are non-biased that can hold people together, then the speed at which everything's moving, who knows what's going to happen, and that could be devastating for a lot of people.
So I guess the question then really becomes who gets the most advantage about not having the API itself?
Who gets the most advantage of not having the API?
So we're going to be, if we need this ground to be covered, right? And there's a lot of there's a lot of debate about the image spec, right? And there's this effort to be, against a registry API. Who does that benefit?
I reckon it's going to benefit people that are either implementing registry APIs or otherwise currently, or making a service of registry APIs.
Yeah.
But there's a number of them, and obviously the predominant one is the Docker Registry V2 API.
Right.
So you've got the Docker Hub and on-prem solutions. You've got Quay, CoreOS acquisition Quay that supports the Docker V2 API, and then you've got open source projects or other people that have implemented around the Docker registry. There's even like Dockyard from Hawaii. And Dockyard's an interesting one because it's a completely open source project that implements not only Docker V1, V2 registry API, but also the Rocket. It can do Rocket push and pull, and they're already actively working on plans for the OCI image format. So there's distribution components involved in the Google Container Registry, GCR.io. So the people at stake are the ones that have an API, but all that is, as an industry standard, is still the Docker V2 registry. So
why wouldn't you just implement the V2?
I reckon that there will be a number of people when integrating with the Open Containers image spec will likely use the Docker V2 registry API. So I don't have an objection to that at all. That's what I was encouraging.
It's interesting, kind of just an interesting discussion. There's lots of, it gets into a lot of, thinking about, how these open source organizations evolve, right? And increasingly with the importance of foundations and the importance of members in these organizations, you start to see almost a little bit of game theory starting to emerge, right? Where it's like, okay, so we take this position, they take that position. Our chances of succeeding are here, but we'll have to give up something over here.
Yeah, and there is a lot of mixed open source and business, and that's one of the interesting parts about even. So I've been with Red Hat for over 4 years now, and have learned a lot and grown a lot of respect for Red Hat in that time frame. But it is really thoroughly an open source thoroughfare. So any given product is not so much a product as just a collection of open source projects that you can go get the source for yourself and get support of. And a lot of this industry is there's loads of people looking to monetize in the open source space, but sometimes that is meaning a mix of proprietary offerings and open source offerings. And while the proprietary might just be an extension of what is an open source project, there's still pieces being offered that are not wholly open source, and that complicates matters a bit because I do like openness and transparency, and when some of these standards you're having people involved that are mixing proprietary and open source, then again, it really all comes back to trying to reduce the risk for the people involved. Because if they are getting into scenarios where they're locked in because their tooling integrated with something that might not be wholly clear and transparent, that's a problem. And it might be a big risk for a company that chooses maybe now is not the right time for a container integration, and that could be...
Because, for example, there may be questions about the future of the registry, how you connect to the registry. And
yeah, maybe
you need to, then they have to think, well, do we want to commit to, for instance, V2, or should we be thinking about other alternatives?
Sure. Yeah. Do we just use this product, or do we implement it ourselves?
And that creates a fragmentation.
Right. Yeah. So.
Great. Well, I learned a lot. Ben, I hope you did.
Sure, definitely.
Vincent, I appreciate your insights and your analysis of this, because I think it helps us kind of understand the dynamics here. I think these foundations and these groups are becoming increasingly important, and the market dynamics are something that we just can't ignore.
Yeah, fair. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Ben, for joining us.
It's great.
Red Hat OpenShift is the sponsor for our container platform coverage from Oscon in Austin, Texas. OpenShift reaches across open source communities to collaborate for healthy upstream development. The goal? Ensure the support for features and functionalities that end users require across the overall ecosystem. You can learn more at openshift.com.